Okay, so now we're going to look at other ways of modeling or deforming objects for the purpose of modeling. So I'm going to create a cube, then lift it up the ground level a bit, scale it up, just lift it above the origin, and in the attribute editor, or I could do this in the channel box, maybe that's visually clearer to see. I'm then going to change the subdivision to 50 in each, make this dense. Cool. So there are a few things we can do to this now. There are extra menus. So I'm holding down spacebar and we have this deform tab. So in here there are a number of tools that serve different purposes. So I could run through each of these, but there's only a few that I end up using generally. But I'll just talk about the notable ones, like blend shapes. That's where you create one original object for, let's say facial animations. You would create the generic head, and then you can create a blend shape which will give you a slider. So what you'll do is you would create the first head of your character, then you'll create duplicates of that, each with the mouth in the shape of a different vowel, let's say. And then using a blend shape, you can animate between those. A cluster, that can be used in rigging, as the picture kind of identifies it's a number of points. So you can essentially select a group of vertices, let's say, and turn them into a cluster in a similar way to, if I press B and slide. So in the same way that using soft selection, so soft selection is B, so I selected one vertex, and I could select an area. So if you want to create a cluster, that is more of a rigging thing. You can essentially select a bunch of vertices, turn that into a cluster, and then control it from this point that will come up, and then move it around. I'm going to go back to the deform menu. So now you've got a few. There's only a handful that I would use. So lattice, that's a main one. So that's not actually worked. So let's go back again. I'm going to click the option box, because lattice, what this will do, will add a wireframe box on top of my box, and from then I can essentially do similar to soft selection, but you're creating this virtual box on top of yours, and then you can manipulate extra areas around there. Actually, I'll leave all these settings at the default and then just click create. So now on my outliner on the left hand side we have the cube, then I've got it says FFD1 lattice, and then the base. So with each of these, so if I move it around, it's not actually doing anything, and this lattice actually is moving the whole cube. But this lattice shape here is just meant for the deformation. So when I right click, when I right click in open space with the lattice selected, I can select a lattice point. So now if I select the corner, say, I can now drag out that area. And if I go to shading and wireframe on shaded, we can actually see, so using this lattice, it allows me to control this dense cube, but with fewer points. So if I want, I could, let's say, select, I'm pressing 4 to go into wireframe if you're not familiar with that, and 5 to go back to shaded. Going 4 on the keyboard just to check what's behind there. and 5. So when I go back to object mode, and then I'm going to turn off the wireframe, now you can see I've got this pretty sort of smooth, because we've got loads of subdivisions, we're getting these nice sort of these curves coming out, like there's no we've got defined edges without having to smooth. And if we smoothed on top of that, I've just hit smoothing, there isn't that much of a difference between smooth and unsmooth. So there we go. So you can add extra cuts into that as well. The thing is with lattice, you have to keep in mind, once you've done this, and if you want to keep the lattice, then if you go to delete by type, when it comes to, if you want to remove all this history that's starting to build up, if you do delete history, that's also going to remove the lattice, so then the shape is baked in. So if I do that, now there's no history on the side and I can't go back, so I've just lost that. So if I go back, I'm pressing Control Z, now what I can do, if I just want to remove this tweak and polycube, I would go to Edit, Delete by Type, Non-Deformer History. So now I've cleaned up the history of my model a bit, and in an open area with my lattice selected, I can still go to Lattice Point and manipulate that around. With the lattice selected on the shape area, I can change the subdivisions. Actually no, you can't. So it doesn't like that. So yeah, that's something to be aware of anyway. So when you're making a lattice, you should put in the amount of points that you think you need first. So let's do that again, deform, and go to the option box. So if you're not sure how many points you might need, you could just up the divisions on the side, and then rather than hit create, you can click apply. You can see what it looks like. If that's too many, then you can tap in open space, go Control Z twice, and then you're back where we started. So if I'm happy with that, I can apply that, and then I'm doing right click in open space, lattice point, select one, then I can move it around freely. And because of the high subdivisions of the model, it's creating these quite smooth pullouts. I can also use the soft selection, which, as I said before, is in the modeling toolkit, soft select, or I'm tapping B on the keyboard, or to move the radius of that, I'm holding down B and scrolling right, so left and right, so I can pull that out further. And now we're left with some sort of bad art. So there we go. It's good. Let's scrap that. I'm going to create another cube. Scale it up. All these cubes on the grid, these squares in fact, they by default are all 1 centimeter. So Maya works in centimeters, so that's something to be aware of if you are building to scale, which you should do really, because that will impact many other things, including things such as render time and lights and that sort of thing. Okay, so I've upped the subdivisions. Actually, I'm going to put everything to 10. Whoops, 10. And now, so I don't alter this later, I'm just going to delete history. So as I do that, there's only one cube in my scene, so I can do delete all by type. delete history, it's removed that subdivisions tweak. So let's look back in the deform menu. So holding down spacebar, I go to deform, and then we have a few here. The ones that I've particularly used over the years, I have not, there's only a few, so I'm only going to cover the ones that I ever really use. So lattice, again cluster, I've used that before but with rigging. You can rig inanimate objects, but it's not relevant for this video. Blend shape, I think I've used like a few times, but I don't particularly do character work. Non-linear, these are better. More specifically, well, I use the bends the most out of all these. So I will just cover the bend, but you get these small little illustrations, and these can be used for things such as animation. So in the past I have rigged objects using clusters, like inanimate objects for commercials. So I would select one end, cluster all the vertices on one end, and then select the other vertices on the other end, cluster them, and then I remember adding a few different non-linear deformers. So I'm going to just add a bend. These settings are fine. So I'm just going to click create, and so now I have these bend deformers up there. So I've got the bend handle in the outliner, so that's selected, but I can't actually see anything until I do wireframe. So when your object is selected, it will create this bend deformer to be the height and size of that object. But it is just a perfectly straight line by default. So what's going to happen is this curvature here is going to be the bend, and the low and high bound is in relation to the object. Where will the low bend and where will the high bend start? So at -1 on the low and 1 at the highest, it means that if I start moving this curvature, it's going to move equally, it's bending equally both ways. So let's say if I put that to, for this object that's a bit too extreme, so 30, and then I'm going to press 4 on my keyboard to look at that. So we can actually see what's happening with the bend handle. So we can go all the way around. But let's say I just want to bend it at one end. What I can do is, now that we have this low bound and high bound, I can turn the low bound from -1 to 0, and that will say basically anywhere from halfway and down don't affect. So let's put that on 0 and go back to shaded. So now the bottom half is not being affected of this object, although this curvature is quite extreme, so now it's folding onto itself. So I'm going to just bend that a bit, and we get this nice uniform bend. So if I press 4 on my keyboard, we can see, I'll just highlight the bend handle. We can see exactly where it's affecting the model. If I change this back to -1 on the low bound, we see the bend handle comes into view again. Cool. So this is very useful. I will talk about this later, the bend deformer, because you can start doing things like keyframing things as well. So let's say if I wanted to animate this, because if you think about it, you can easily animate something wiggling back and forward. And all you've done is just add the bend handle. So you could keyframe there, and then keyframe back again. And you haven't had to rig anything or anything. So another thing to consider with the bend handle is you can actually move it in relation to the object. So as I pull it down, you can see it affects more of the object, because these low and high bounds are essentially, this is basically the bottom. By default, this would be bottom half, high bound would be top half. But then you can change the playing field by just moving the actual handle. And you start to get these interesting effects like that. So there's a lot you could play around with that. I think you can also rotate it, and that is very, very trippy. So not sure what use you could get out of rotating it, but there you go. Cool. So I'm going to remove all of that. That's the bend deformer. Spacebar, create, do a cube again. So I keep deleting the cubes that I'm doing because there are times where Maya doesn't like when you do a lot of deforming and things to objects. So that's why I keep saying delete history, because Maya can be a bit glitchy with altering objects. Okay, so I've created this, I've subdivided it, delete history. And let's go to the deformer, so non-linear. So I'll quickly show you one more, but they do similar effects. They're kind of self-explanatory. Let's go to twist. If I press 4 on the keyboard, you can see we have these circles at the top and bottom, and then this line, which would be the handle. And so as you can imagine, when we start to rotate the start angle, then it manipulates our object. So you could animate, I think I've used this for animating a drinks box, like orange juice or something, you know, commercials type stuff. So you can animate it using that. You just change the start angle, you move up, and then you would have to change the end angle to catch up with it, so you get that nice snapping animation. So you animate the start angle to a certain point, and then the end angle, say, well, I might demonstrate that in a different video, but that's how you would possibly animate that if you wanted the cartoony looking effect. So we have the low bound and high bound again, same sort of thing. Just think of it as bottom half and top half. There we go, and we can move it up and down a bit as well. So that could be an interesting drill effect, but again, it's sort of a cartoony looking effect when used in that way. It's interesting. Great, I'm going to delete that now. The texture deformer, I'll show you what I use it generally with. So with polyplanes, so let's start with the polyplane. Okay, I could probably subdivide that more, so I'll do 60 by 60. Let's go crazy, 100 by 100, and then I'm going to delete history. Then select the object, deform, texture deform. I'm going to drop in a texture and go to the, I might as well go to the checker one again. Okay, so this is being projected down, so that's cool. We have checkers on our object. 5. So that's modeling done. Pretty quick and easy. You have this offset because sometimes if you're using a very faint image, so Maya, when you import the image, is basically looking at the black and white values. So if you get a color picture from Google, let's say, it might not have high contrast values. So as you put the strength higher, it will pull the polygons away from where the mesh was originally based, and then you have to offset it again. So as you can see, as I pull the offset down, it lowers the model, and when I push it up, it takes it the other way. So other uses for this, recently I went to texture, so you could put in your files. So if you've got a picture from Google, you could do some tests. You could get a picture of a friend or something, put it in the file, and then see how well their picture comes out. But recently I've been using, where is it? The water, no, let's go ocean. So I've just put an ocean texture on there. So it's very faint, so we can't really see much, but there is something going on. You gotta have faith. So I'm just gonna go a bit further. Let's go 40. So look at that, we're starting to see something, but it's very faint. And I'll tell you why that is, because look at these values in here. So the texture that's actually being applied, this is built into Maya. We have all these functions and settings here, but it's very faint, sort of mid-gray. So with the texture deformer, sort of mid-gray area is basically pretty much flat. So in black would be going inwards and white would be coming outwards. So there's very low contrast in this. So that's why when I'm adding strength, I've put this all the way up to 40, and the higher I put it, it's trying to use this image and then pull polygons in and out. But because it's so faint, I'm having to put my strength up really high, which means I'll also have to put the offset really low to pull it back down, because I want it on the ground. So I'm having to put that down like 50, 100. So now it's on ground level again. And now we can start to see some detail. So we have that there. So the way to get around that would be to not have to have all the really high strength and a lot of offset, would be to have a higher contrast image. So if I start playing around with this a bit more, you can see there it's actually changing dynamically in my viewport. And the reason that's happened is because you can now see we have this higher contrast. We've got these greater difference between the blacks and whites. So look at that, that's pretty cool. So I pull this wave height down, we've got barely nothing. So let's look at the thumbnail again. Yeah, it's very, very mid-gray. So the end result is nothing. So this will work with any input you add into it. So even if you get a color picture from Google, it'll try and work out, the darks and lights of that. But essentially it's just looking, a lot of the inputs within Maya, they're just looking for black and white values between 0 and 1. So black would be 0 and white would be 1. So it's like, if you think about it, it's like having on and off. So in the texture input, I'll just do one more for fun. Let's go with, that's procedural cloth. That's what it looks like. So there's quite a lot of contrast in there, but I just remembered I turned that off. Holy moly, look at that, Jesus Christ. I put the strength on 10. It's quite a high contrast picture, so look at that result. So I would say this is the kind of pattern that they use in some video games like Battlefield, because it's very pristine when you look at their uniforms in the games. They have this nice repeating pattern, so I would imagine it's a very small, repeatable, inbuilt pattern similar to this inside the games engine. Because look at that result, that's pretty cool. How long did that take? No time. So let's say you're happy with that. So remember, when you're deleting history, you've got these two options, history and non-deformer. So you've got to be careful. If you want to keep this option open, the texture deformer attributes, you've got to hit that. So now that's removed history, but I can still tweak this. There we go, that's one more. Okay, so in this scene, what I've got is a polyplane, and then there is no history in it. So how this was created was using the texture deformer, which is in spacebar, deform, and where is it, texture. Then I applied a 1K by 1K image, which is just dirt. I applied a Lambert as well, so not only was it deformed by the same picture, so it was deformed. I'll just load this up. So this is just a 1K tileable gravelly picture, and then I repeated it a few times, so if I zoom out you can actually see it's been tiled a number of times. So that was used in the texture deformer, and then I removed history, so I just have this. So let's say we wanted to create some paths, so we have, or this could be a field or something like that. So I will select this, and what we can use is we do have this sculpt tool area. So I'm holding down shift, then right click to bring up this modeling / manipulator area for the object, and then I can go to sculpt, and then it brings up this brush, and then at the bottom of the screen it says sculpting on P-plane shape 1. So if I want to change my brush area size, I can use the hotkey of B and move my mouse left and then to right to make it bigger. If I go to the, the tool settings, then I have this heads up display for the size and the strength. By default, I think that's 15. And then we have things like fall off, stylus. You can stamp, so you can change essentially the alpha of the brush. So at the moment, this would just be pretty much a flat circle, but with a bit of fall off. So if you imagine a circle with a bit of blurring around the edge, like a standard Photoshop type brush. So if we picked something like this full square here, there would be no fall off. So it would just be like a pure shape, pure white value. But by default, we do have this smoothing off at the edges. Cool. So now with this selected, let's say this was a field and I wanted to have plowed areas. So I could just start to, actually I'll make the brush a bit bigger, so B, and then I was moving the brush to the right. So I could start to sculpt these up a bit. So they're very uneven. But then again, fields are uneven, so plausible deniability. There you go. So I'm going to press Shift and right click, and this gives me more options. So I'm in the sculpting tool at the moment, and there are a few extra things we can do. Whoops. So I can go to grab, and this will allow me to grab a chunk, as is in the name. Let's say I suddenly wanted to have a massive hill. So I'm going to make this brush even bigger. There we go. So there's been an explosion underneath the field. The farmer is going mental. But there we go. We've got this. So this is our field. Something's happened. There we go. I'm going to press Shift and right click. Then we can add a bit of a bulge if we fancy a bulge. And look at that. That's immediately destroying my geometry. And why is that? It's because this geometry is pretty low poly for what I've already added to it. So I added that texture, deformed it. So there's a lot of in and outs. So this bulge effect is having too much of an intense effect on it. So let's say I've done that and I can't go back. So what we could do is we could press Shift, right click, and we could go to the smooth area. And we can just try and smooth this out. So now we have this smoothed out bulge. So we've kind of repaired that mess. We also have the flatten function, which does a little bit something like this. It's smoothing as well as flattening the surface. So it's somewhere in between the smooth and flat. Yeah, it's smooth will kind of flatten your surface a bit because we already had this deformation on it. So you might just have to be cautious with using that. Let's just go over a few more of these things. So this is like if anyone's used ZBrush, it's wax buildup. So imagine candle wax, when it drops on something, it just adds a layer. So this is probably better for a base sculpt of something. So if you wanted to make a field, you might want to add this noisy texture deformer on top. So you could create these plowed bits like that. Control on the keyboard and, sorry, when you hold down Control and paint, it will go inwards, so it's inverting. And then Shift is smoothing, but much lighter than what happened over here. And then we have the pinch function, which will bring in the faces together, as you can see there. I could imagine that being useful for more refining on characters if you're trying to bring certain polygons or topology together. And let's go on freeze. I think this is masking. So yeah, pressing Control removes the freeze off of it. So let's freeze an area and then do a little quick test and then grab a bunch. Yeah, so it's preventing us from destroying our model. So in this instance, I probably should have just frozen the entire model before continuing. What else? Yeah, so that's all. You've got a few there. There are a few extra ones there. Again, these are similar to, I'm pretty sure they have these in ZBrush. Mudbox is made by the same company, if that still exists, so that will have the same sort of features. So you might just want to have a play around with them. So things like knife will be very extreme. There we go. So you could include things using the knife tool and then smooth them out a bit to get those defined cuts into things. That sort of thing. And maybe I will just quickly smooth all of this. And I keep pressing hotkeys for Mari and ZBrush. Okay, I'm going to smooth that out. Let's go exit sculpting. Cool. So that's fine. So that area that was frozen in the corner, it still has that deformation from the texture deformer. So let's say we're happy with that field sculpt. So this is ready to be in a feature film, I guess. So let's hold down spacebar, deform, texture. Then in the attributes editor, texture deformer, I will go load in a texture from, where was this? Cool. And I'm going to turn off the texture mode. This viewport is in 6, so I'll go to 5. And now I get that extra detail upon my masterful sculpting. So there you have it, another little feature, the sculpting brushes.